So we talked about the shear thing here, and I want to point out that there are some times this is a problem in which engineers don't leave a good safety mark. An example of this was, I'm not going to say where this was, but it was actually at a university in Texas quite some number of years ago, a couple decades back now. The building, one of the buildings had been built here so that it had a facade here, and up high they had concrete blocks. And so the concrete, when they built it, the company that built it had fabricated these by taking these concrete blocks and fabricating them on the ground and putting rebar in them and then lifting them into position. Okay, and this was actually right over the main entranceway of the building. And so to make the concrete cure quicker, they'd put additives into the concrete to make it cure quicker, so they didn't have to wait as long before they could lift it into position. So a time-saving measure. Problem was that over the years, the chemicals started degrading the rebar that was in there, because the chemicals were very corrosive. And so about 15 years, 10 to 15 years after they built it, then what happened was that all of a sudden a big chunk of this came crashing down. And then when engineers went to investigate it, they noticed that other parts were flaking and about to come crashing down. And so they ended up having to replace this entire structure up there. And unfortunately, the company that had originally built it had since gone out of business. And so the university was stuck with the cost. Another example, and that is another university. I know a lot of things about what happened at universities. They had used some large granite blocks suspended over a walkway, and to support the granite blocks, they had embedded steel rods in the, and then they had little hooks that held the steel rods. And architecturally, to make it look pretty, they closed off the bottoms down here. Okay. Problem is the top was open, and so every time it rained, it'd fill up with water. And so it obviously started a little bit of rust going on in there. Well, the problem is the water evaporated, but this being a metropolitan area, because this university was actually in the DFW area, then what happened was that every time it rained, the water came back, but when it evaporated, it left behind chemicals, basically acid rain. And so every time it rained, the steel rods were being soaked in acid. And so eventually what happened was one of them corroded, because as they got soaked in acid, they started getting weaker. And as they got weaker, the area got smaller. Well, F over A, ultimate strength. And so if A gets smaller, then eventually you reach the ultimate strength and it shears. In fact, it did. And then two large granite blocks came crashing down to the ground underneath. Actually happened in the middle of the night. No one was underneath it, and no one was hurt. So that's again an example here of poor engineering, poor architecture, where someone didn't think everything through. And again, it would have held perfectly fine, except that the architects had decided it looked better to seal off the bottom, and that decision was made actually without the engineers' knowledge. And so that led to the problem that happened.